And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing storminess here all across the west from the Arctic coast there all the way down into the Alaska Peninsula, with the worst conditions in the warning advisory locations, Yukon, Kuskokwim Delta, right on up into the western Arctic coast for snow and blowing snow with still pretty strong winds. Improving here along the coast, especially behind the front here with the tighter gradient slowly edging eastward, increasing clouds central interior, increasing clouds here for south central Alaska, but staying nice in the east on down the panhandle for tomorrow. This system really weakens here and actually edges back to the west just a little bit in response to this low coming up and the southeast flow associated with it. So dry, mostly sunny here, east, southeast interior, all the way down the panhandle again under high pressure with light winds. Lighter winds over all of the western areas tomorrow with even lighter snow amounts. Rain and wind on the increase, the Alaska Peninsula, and look for a big increase in the wind and precipitation, Kodiak Island on up into Kenai Peninsula, south central Alaska, western North Gulf Coast, staying mostly sunny, mid and upper Tanana Valley, actually from the eastern Arctic coast right on down into the eastern North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle under high pressure. Colder northerly winds out over the eastern Bering Sea with snow showers, especially for the Pribilof Islands. Coastal water forecast, north winds 10 knots on the south coast. North coast, light variable winds for the day Tuesday. North at 10 for Lynn Canal. North at 10 for Clarence Strait. North winds 15 knots for Stevens Passage with seas up to 3 feet. And for the day on Wednesday, east to southeast winds on the south coast at only 10 knots with 4 to 5 foot seas. Southeast on the central coast, 15 to 20 knots. And the north coast, southeast winds 20 to 30 knots with seas up to 14 feet. North winds at 15 for Lynn Canal. And the central, or for Stevens Passage, northwest at 10, southeast 15 for Clarence Strait. Prince William Sound, east wind 10 knots, seas 2 feet for the day on Tuesday. Eastern North Gulf Coast, variable winds at 10 knots, east winds at 20 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. East at 30 here for the Barren Islands, turning southeast at 30 for Kamishak Bay. Southern Cook Inlet, southeast winds at 20 knots. Northern Cook Inlet, light variable winds at 10 knots. And then for Wednesday, Cook Inlet, north winds, northeast winds 20 to 30 knots here. Strongest south of the Forelands. We've got storm warnings for both the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay right out of the east at 50 knots in both locations with seas up to 21 feet for the Barren Islands. Gale warnings for the western North Gulf Coast. East winds 40 knots, seas 18 feet. East side here, east winds at 30 knots. And Prince William Sound, east winds 20 knots with 4 foot seas. Kodiak Island, east-southeasterlies tomorrow at 30 knots. Bristol Bay, southeast 25, Alaska Peninsula, east-southeast 20 to 25 knots. And then for Wednesday, we've got northwest winds for the western Alaska Peninsula, 25 to 30 knots. East at 30 knots for Bristol Bay, good gales for Kodiak Island, including Shelikof Strait for east winds at 40 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, variable to, let's call it variable winds, 15 to 25 knots. West winds 30 knots for the Adak-Atka area, and the western Aleutians, north to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. And then for Wednesday, Kiska to Shimia, southwest 20 knots. Amchitka Island, northwest at 20. Adak and Atka, small craft advisories, northwest winds 30 knots. Gale warnings for the eastern Aleutians for northwest winds 35 knots with seas 9 to 15 feet. And for the southwest coast, strongest winds tomorrow will be along the Kuskokwim Delta coast out of the south at 25 knots. Otherwise, Yukon Delta coast line and offshore waters there, southwest at 15. But gale warnings for Norton Sound, south winds 35 knots, only 20 knots for St. Lawrence Island. St. Matthew Island, northwest at 25 knots, variable at 20 for the Pribilofs. And then on Wednesday, St. Paul and St. George, northwesterlies at 30 knots, northeast 20 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. St. Matthew Island, north at 25. And for the Yukon Delta coast, light north winds, 15 knots, east 15 for Norton Sound, and east 20 for St. Lawrence Island. For the eastern Boulevard Sea coast, Barter Island eastward, demarcation point, southeast of 15 tomorrow. Otherwise, south at 30, south 25 for the central coast and the western Arctic coast, southeast at 25. And for the Chukchi Sea, south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. And for Wednesday, the Chukchi Sea looking at north winds 15 to 20 knots. Central and western Arctic coast, northeast winds 15 knots. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, winds will be variable at about 10 knots.